Hey everyone, and welcome to another Kanoa Reviews, where we review games both new and old on all platforms. If you like the content that I make, then please subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so you never miss a review when it comes out. Today we talk about the game Call of Juarez, the Cartel. Call of Juarez, back in the day, was a first-person shooter series that enjoyed a few iterations with a western setting and theme before we got the open-world equivalent of something like Red Dead Redemption. Having games set in the Wild West was already a niche back then, as it is still now. I have never played the original Call of Juarez, but I own the sequel, Bound in Blood, which I know had favorable reviews, and more recently the series has changed to a strategy genre and has also gotten positive feedback by both community and critics. However, the odd one out in the family is Call of Juarez, the Cartel, which is ultimately a huge flop and is by some considered as one of the worst games of all time. Instead of sticking to the western setting in the 19th century, it takes on a modern look with drug gangs and Mexican cartels in Los Angeles. Towards the end of the campaign, it exchanges the busy city streets, nightclubs, and ghettos for more traditional western-looking towns and squares, and there's also one of the playable characters who dresses like a cowboy and can dual-wield revolvers like you could in the previous entries. This character is a direct descendant from the main characters in the previous game, but other than that, many people failed to see how this set forth the legacy of the western genre, and many people hated this for it. But ironically, the whole LA drug gang and cartel setting was something that I thought was very cool, and had not been explored that much yet in a first-person setting where, if you were fighting gangsters, they usually were just faceless thugs guilty of crimes rarely coming to the forefront. Call of Juarez the Cartel brings this straight to your face, with the gangsters growing weed, distributing coke, being involved with human trafficking, etc. Some pretty heinous stuff, and in a way, I always saw this game as the Narcos game amongst the video games, even though this title does predate that show by a long time. So personally, I thought that the setting was pretty interesting and unique, and the fact that the entire campaign revolved around 3 characters, all which could be played by actual players for a 3-player co-op experience, made it to where I was more interested in this and in the end might even like it a bit more than the average gamer. Now it's nowhere near being a great title, but I also have to disagree that it's not as bad as some of the critics say it is. In a way, I see this game as my guilty pleasure, a game I know and I can see that it's not that good, but I have enjoyed myself with it thoroughly nonetheless. Let's take a deep dive and find out why. So the story in the Cartel revolves around 3 characters working for different government forces, the police, the FBI, and the DEA, and they will join forces together to overcome a giant cartel and working their way up in taking out the big players by first trying to fake a gang war between 2 rival groups. Though the story setup initially can sound pretty basic and like a dime in a dozen, there are actually a ton of characters you will meet during this campaign, and the game is very cutscene heavy. You are frequently watching cutscenes that can last close to 10 minutes, and I did like the cinematic approach very much since I like narc shows like Narcos, etc. But my only critique here is that there are sometimes so many names that get thrown around, and many of the characters don't leave a good enough impression to where you can link the name to a face you have seen before. All 3 of the main characters are very distinct and unique, but the same cannot be said for all the other side characters. The game starts you out fighting the various gangs in places throughout LA, like the ghettos, the freeway, the dockyard, and various nightclubs. Eventually you head to Juarez, and even some locations from the previous game, and take the cartel head-on in the climax. Graphically, the game won't win too many prizes, but it's made by Techland, the same company that is responsible for games like Dead Island and Dying Light, and I have to admit that I have always loved the look of their games in general. The engine that they use always brings out the vibrant colors and gives you a certain sense of being on vacation. Dead Island is a perfect example of this, but even here I have to admit that the game kind of feels nice to look at with the sun rays portraying through the trees, the yellow sand of the desert having a pleasant warm color, and the overall vibe you get is kind of like a summer vibe. This is also partly due to how much bloom they use, and they use it a lot. Sometimes you might almost want to wipe the screen as it seems that it's sprayed down with Vaseline, but it makes the game look even more like summer or that of a pleasant dream state. If one were to come down on it technically, it has some pretty blurry textures and character models lacking detail. But in all honesty, I like the look of this game, mostly also because we have rarely seen LA like this in video games back then. The weather is always nice, the grass is always green, and the sun is always bright. Now gameplay wise, it works like your average shooting experience, but with a small twist that works both in co-op and also in single player. Let's first talk about the shooting itself. The shooting mechanics are average but do their job just fine. I have played much worse shooter mechanically like Kane and Lynch, and this game does an adequate job of conveying the battles that you take on. You will fight groups of thugs over and over again, but they are not bullet sponges, and some of the weapons feel pretty nice to use. Before each mission starts, you are sent to a lobby where you can alter your loadout and take a different main weapon or sidearm. The amount of weapons you can play with is quite good, and some you need to unlock by leveling up by completing certain objectives, which also gives you a reason to tackle some side stuff. Since the game is built around 3-player co-op, the levels you play in are linear but contain areas that are pretty open and offer the ability to flank. This makes it to where the shooting feels just a slightly bit better, as you can make your own approach or route up a hill or down the open docks. There's your typical gimmick of gaining adrenaline points by getting kills and then getting a slow-mo for a short while to get some easy hits in. This was also in the heyday of Call of Duty, and thus those iconic door breach scenes where you enter a room in slow motion are plentiful in this game. A bit too plentiful if you ask me, since they are nowhere near as spectacular or as satisfying as in Call of Duty. It's not only shooting that you will be doing though, as there are also a few driving sections. Now in single player, you'll be taking the wheel while the AI is in the backseat will lean out of the car and fire at incoming enemies. In co-op, of course, it's a bit more dynamic, with one player driving and the other two firing. It's simple, and we have seen this in other shooters too, but it's always something that works, since it offers just a slight variation in gameplay depending on who you play as and with. There are also short sections where the group splits up, and a player will be on his or her own for a little while, and this always gets appreciated. It makes some operations and missions feel just a bit more grand scale and offer that awesome dynamic variety in having a player be on Overwatch with a sniper rifle while the others head into a nightclub to set up a meeting. It honestly is more effort that was put into this co-op campaign than it could have done. The World at War co-op experience, for example, is way more lackluster. Now don't get me wrong, Call of Duty World at War in co-op is better because the game is better. But the co-op is just literally popping a second, third, or fourth clone of the player in the game and altering nothing. No one splits off or has their own unique experience unlike this. They could have easily copy-pasted the single-player experience to multiplayer, but they did not, and the game is all the better for it. There are even a few sections where you get to engage in hand-to-hand combat, and it's yet again very simple, but pretty entertaining. You only do this like 5 or 6 times, and so that never overstays its welcome. If anything, it's a nice short diversion from the rest of the shooting. There are also sections where you won't be seeing action for a while, but need to interrogate people to get more information. A level in a strip club, for example, has you searching for a specific girl, and so you first need to question some of the other girls and then head upstairs to a VIP area to find hints and clues about her whereabouts. All while you do this, not a single bullet is fired, but it's just exploring, talking to people, and taking in the shady atmosphere. Then let's talk about that little twist I mentioned earlier, and this is actually something pretty cool that I wish more co-op games would implement. In the story, every character has their own personal agenda, besides the main story plot as well. The cowboy McCall gets called in by some street workers who have it rough, and so during missions he is asked to steal some cash or valuables to give to them so they can sell it and buy food for themselves and their offspring. Character Eddie, however, is in a lot of debt himself, and therefore is asked to steal drugs during the missions to pay off his debt. You get these assignments through a phone call during the missions, and the cool thing is that none of the other players can hear what is being said to you. Only you know what or who you are looking for when you get one of these side objectives. Sometimes you also get a side objective to talk to someone who's blackmailing a friend, etc. And the whole shtick of this gameplay is that you have to do these actions out of sight of the other characters or players. Now, even though the other players don't know exactly what you have to do, they do sometimes get a phone call that states to look out for any suspicious activity by the other players. And here comes the gameplay twist that just feels quite unique, and though it's only a small part of the gameplay experience, it was still unique enough to where I would love to see it implemented in other games too. Whenever you want to steal any of the assigned objectives like money, drugs, or valuables, you need to wait until no one is near you or at least not looking into your direction. Now, if you are playing in single player, this is rather easy, as you can just lead the AI away from the item and then rush into a room to go and grab it. But in multiplayer, it is much more complex, and you can have some really fun and hilarious situations. There can be, for example, a moment where you all three decide to split up, like in the strip club where you need to question the various strippers. In this area, there are some valuables to get for specific characters, and so they can pretend like they are talking to the girls who work there, but in reality, they are going around the room to get the required optional items without being spotted or caught by the other players. You can even deceive them or lie by yelling out certain players to head into a specific room or place, and then quickly heading to the item you need and grabbing it before they notice. This often leads to really funny conversations with each other on what you were doing just now or how suspicious you are being. It's great because it adds a slightly bit more competitiveness without the game leading too much to a competitive nature. It's still a main co-op game at its core, but adds a bit of rivalry that works so much better than a tacky scoring system like you have in some co-op games. This really felt unique enough to where I was doing my own thing while helping my fellow friends in completing the main story, while also watching them from time to time seeing if they would behave. It's yet again a gameplay aspect I really liked about this game, and overall, I just had a really good time with it. My only critique would be that the levels get a bit less interesting towards the end, since I find the desert levels and setting just pretty boring in general, and I guess the action itself can become a bit repetitive since it's the same type of enemies you fight throughout the entire game. There were also some cutscenes that felt unfinished by lack of polish or even lacking sound effects, but overall I really had a pretty good time with it. Everything screams that this is a B game instead of a AAA title, but that is totally fine. I honestly do not understand how people can call it one of the worst games ever when you have garbage like Rogue Warrior, Terminator 3 Genesis, or Kane and Lynch. This game is raw, rough around the edges, and nothing special, but succeeds in delivering a straight-to-the-point experience with actual some fun gimmicks in the process. In the end, Call of Juarez the Cartel gets a 7.6. Now I believe that this game cannot currently be purchased anymore on Steam, which makes it one of my rarer games in my collection. As I mentioned before, I also do own the predecessor, Bound in Blood, and pretty much all the critics and player base prefer that title to this, so it might be about time for me to dive deeper into that game as well, and see where it stands to this bastard child within the family.